He had paid for silence, for a pair of hands to scrub the grief from the floorboards and knead life back into the stale flour. The men from the railroad camp, their faces etched with the mean sort of humor that festers in harsh sun and cheap whiskey, had called it a marriage. They'd laughed, their teeth stained brown, as they pushed her forward into the dust of his barren yard. She was a ghost in a borrowed dress, her belly a gentle, undeniable swell beneath the thin cotton. A cruel joke, they'd said. Saddle the stone-hearted widower, Caleb, with the one thing he couldn't abide, a life he hadn't chosen, a future he hadn't buried with his Sarah. He'd looked at her, this girl they called her eyes two dark pools reflecting the vast, indifferent sky. They held no plea, only a profound and weary stillness. He saw not the joke, but the echo of his own desolation. He tossed a small, heavy pouch of coin at the feet of the lead man, a clink of gold that sounded final, like a nail in a coffin. "Get off my land," was all he said. The men left, their laughter trailing them like smoke until the wind tore it to shreds. And then there were three. Caleb, a man carved from the granite of the mountains that shadowed his ranch, his daughter, Lily, a 5-year-old wisp who hadn't uttered a sound since the fire, and now a pregnant stranger who was, by the territory's loose and cruel laws, his wife. He pointed to the small, lean-to room off the main cabin. There, he grunted, the word a stone dropping into the well of silence between them. He did not look at her again, turning his back to mend a fence that did not need mending, a task for his hands while his soul remained in disrepair. He expected tears, or perhaps a fearful protest. He received neither. He received only the quiet rustle of cloth as she entered the cold, dark space that was now her home. "I did not weep." Tears were a currency she could no longer afford. The cabin was a mausoleum of memory, thick with the scent of dust and a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical chill. A single rocking chair sat near the cold hearth, draped with a faded shawl that still held the faint outline of a woman's shoulders. The man, Caleb, was a fortress, his grief a high wall she had no intention of scaling. His daughter, a pale little moon, watched her from the shadows, her eyes wide and ancient. Mai understood this language of loss. It was the only tongue they all shared. She began not with words, but with work. Her first act was to find a bucket and a rag. She scrubbed the grime from the single window pane until the weak afternoon light spilled onto the floorboards, illuminating the dance of dust motes. She found a broom and swept away the brittle leaves and dirt that had gathered in the corners, her movements rhythmic and serene. In the pantry, she discovered half a sack of weevil-shot flour and a tin of lard. Her hands, nimble and certain, went to work. Soon, the cold, dead air of the cabin was filled with the impossible scent of baking bread. It was a humble, earthy fragrance, a testament to survival. When Caleb finally returned at dusk, smelling of sweat and sawdust, he stopped dead in the doorway. The cabin was transformed. A small fire crackled in the hearth, pushing back the gloom. The floor was clean. And on the rough-hewn table sat a small, golden-brown loaf of bread next to a bowl of thin stew she had made from dried beans and a handful of wild onions. He looked at the food, then at her. She stood by the fire, her silhouette softened by the flickering light, her gaze fixed on the flames. He said nothing. He simply sat, pulled the bread toward him, and ate. It was the first warm thing that had passed his lips in a year, and it tasted like a forgotten forgiveness. The little girl, Lily, was Mai's shadow. She was a silent observer, her presence as constant and unobtrusive as the wind sighing through the eaves. She watched Mai's hands as they mended a tear in her small dress with neat, nearly invisible stitches. She watched as Mai coaxed a tiny garden from a patch of stubborn, rocky soil behind the cabin, planting seeds she had carefully saved in a small cloth pouch from her long journey. Lily never came too close, maintaining a careful distance as if separated by a pane of invisible glass. Mai never pushed. She would sometimes hum a low, melancholic melody from a life she had left behind, the notes hanging in the air like dandelion fluff. She spoke to the child not in English, a language of hard edges and harsh commands, but in the soft, flowing cadence of her mother tongue, telling her stories about mischievous river spirits and clever moon rabbits. Lily would listen, her head cocked, her expression unreadable. One afternoon, as Mai sat on the porch steps, carefully sketching a flower in the dirt with a twig, Lily approached. She stopped just inches away, her small bare feet dusty. She pointed a trembling finger at the simple drawing of a blossom with 5 petals. Mai's heart stilled. She looked at the child, whose eyes were fixed on the dirt drawing. Then, Lily's gaze lifted to Mai's face. A sound, fragile as a bird's egg, escaped her lips. "Pretty," she whispered, the word raspy from disuse. It was the first word she had spoken since the fire had stolen her mother. From the shadows of the barn, where he had been oiling a harness, Caleb heard it. The sound pierced the armor around his heart, a single, perfect note in a world of discord. He saw his daughter take another step, her small hand reaching out to tentatively touch the sleeve of Mai's dress. He did not move, did not breathe, a statue witnessing a miracle he did not deserve. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer a chasm of grief and mistrust, but a quiet space of waiting. Lily's single word had been a seed, and now, in the stillness, it began to grow. She would bring my treasures, a smooth grey stone, a fallen bluebird's feather, a misshapen wildflower clutched in her fist. She would not speak again, not yet, but her eyes had begun to ask questions. Mai would accept each gift with a solemn grace, placing the stone on the windowsill or tucking the feather into a crack in the log wall. She was building a new world for the child, piece by precious piece. Caleb watched it all from his self-imposed exile. He saw the way Lily's shoulders had begun to lose their permanent, fearful hunch. He saw the way she would sit closer to Mai by the fire in the evenings, her small form leaning almost imperceptibly toward the woman's warmth. He felt a profound and unsettling shift within himself. This woman, this joke, had done in weeks what he had failed to do in a year. She had reached into the silent, shuttered room of his daughter's heart and let in a sliver of light. He felt a sting of resentment, sharp and jealous, that it was not him. But beneath it, deeper and more powerful, was a current of gratitude so overwhelming it frightened him. He had paid for a housekeeper, and instead, a healer had walked into his life. He found himself lingering in the cabin longer in the mornings, the aroma of her simple cooking a tether he was reluctant to break. He watched her hands as she worked, seeing not a servant's labor but a quiet, powerful grace. He was a man who understood the language of doing, and every one of her actions spoke of a resilience that humbled him. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, yet she was slowly, methodically rebuilding his broken world around him. The sky began to turn a bruised purple long before dusk, the wind picking up a keening, mournful sound. The air grew heavy, thick with the promise of violence. Caleb knew the signs. A winter blizzard, early and ferocious, was descending from the northern peaks. He worked with a grim urgency, securing the livestock in the barn, reinforcing the shutters on the cabin, his movements economical and practiced. Inside, Mai watched the world disappear behind a swirling curtain of white. The wind clawed at the small cabin, a hungry animal trying to find a way in. The temperature plummeted. It was on the second night, with the world outside a formless, roaring fury, that Lily began to cough. It started as a small, dry rasp, but by morning it had deepened into a wet, ragged sound that tore at the suffocating quiet of the cabin. A fever took hold, her small face flushing a dangerous red, her skin hot to the touch. Caleb's carefully constructed walls of stoicism crumbled into dust. He saw not Lily, but Sarah, his first wife, her face pale in the moonlight. He felt the phantom heat of the fire, the suffocating helplessness of loss. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. The laudanum was nearly gone, and the nearest doctor was a 2-day ride in good weather. In this storm, it was an eternity. He paced the small floor, a caged beast, his own grief threatening to drown him. It was Mai who remained calm. Her face was a mask of serene focus. She moved with a purpose that shamed his frantic terror. She bathed Lily's forehead with snowmelt, her touch gentle. She went to her small room and returned with a bundle of dried herbs, their strange, pungent aroma filling the air as she brewed a dark, steaming tea. She forced the bitter liquid past Lily's cracked lips, a spoonful at a time, murmuring to her in her soft, lilting language. For hours that stretched into an eternity, she did not leave the child's side. Caleb could only watch, a useless giant in his own home. He saw the deep, maternal instinct that flared in her eyes, a fierce, protective fire for a child that was not hers. He saw the exhaustion that carved faint lines around her mouth, but she did not falter. The blizzard raged on, sealing them in a world of white noise and fear. In the deepest hour of the third night, with the fire burning low and Lily's breathing shallow and fast, he finally broke. "The fire," he rasped, the words tearing from his throat. "I couldn't get to her." To Sarah he stared into the embers, but he was seeing another fire, a hungrier one. She was with child. A boy. I was in town for supplies. When I came back he didn't need to finish. The silence was filled with the roar of flames that only he could hear. Mai looked at him, her dark eyes holding a universe of empathy. She did not offer empty platitudes. She simply reached out and placed a hand on the small of Lily's back, a gesture of steadfast presence. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "They promise me a husband," she said, her gaze distant. "A merchant. In San Francisco. He had a wife. I was a second choice, brought for his brother. But the brother did not want me." She paused, her hand stroking Lily's fever-damp hair. "The first man, he was not kind. When he learned of my child, he sent me away. To the railroad camp. To be rid of me in that small, storm-battered cabin. They were no longer a master and a possession. They were two survivors, their separate pasts of fire and betrayal laid bare, their shared present a fragile vigil over a fading child. By the fifth day, the storm broke. The world outside was a pristine, blinding expanse of white under a painfully blue sky. And inside the cabin, Lily's fever had broken with it. Her breathing was even, her skin cool to the touch. She was sleeping a deep, healing sleep, her small hand curled around one of Mai's fingers. The relief that washed over Caleb was so immense it left him weak, his knees trembling. He looked at Mai, who was slumped in the chair beside the bed, her own face pale with exhaustion, her pregnancy a more pronounced curve beneath her worn dress. She had not slept for 2 days. She had saved his daughter. She had saved him from the ghost of his own failure. He felt a debt that could never be repaid with coin or land. It was a debt of the soul. He went outside, the cold air a slap to his face, and began the arduous task of digging a path to the barn. The physical labor was a balm, a way to process the immense shift that had occurred within him. The world was new, scoured clean by the storm, and so was he. Later that week, a rider appeared on the horizon, a dark speck against the snow. It was Barlow, the portly town merchant who had brokered the cruel deal, flanked by 2 of his cronies. They rode up to the cabin with an air of smug ownership, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and malice. Barlow dismounted, his boots sinking into the deep snow. "Well, Caleb," he boomed, his voice offensively loud in the clean, quiet air. "Came to see how your little mail-order experiment is holding up. Figured you'd be about ready to send her packing." He peered toward the cabin door, a lecherous grin spreading across his face as he caught a glimpse of Mai standing just inside, holding a sleeping Lily. "Getting round, ain't she? Won't be long before you've got another mouth to feed. A foreign one, at that." A cold, quiet rage, unlike any he had ever known, settled over Caleb. It wasn't the hot, blind fury of his youth, but something ancient and immovable, like the granite of the mountains. He had spent a year letting the world trample over the wreckage of his life, too lost in his own grief to fight back. But the storm had washed that man away. He took a single step forward, positioning himself squarely between Barlow and the cabin door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The lethal calm in his eyes was more terrifying than any shout. "This is my wife," he said, the words dropping like stones into the snow. His hand moved, not with speed, but with a deliberate, final grace, to rest on the worn leather handle of the pistol at his hip. "This is my home. And that is my child she is holding." He let the words hang in the frigid air, each one a stake driven into the ground, claiming his territory. He looked directly into Barlow's suddenly panicked eyes. "You will get on your horse, and you will ride off my land. And if you or any of your men ever set foot here again, I will not ask you to leave." Barlow, who had built his petty empire on bullying and intimidation, saw something in Caleb's face he had never seen before, a man with something to protect. A man who had found his purpose. The merchant's bluster evaporated. He stammered, his face turning a blotchy red, and scrambled back onto his horse. Without another word, he and his men turned and rode away, their retreat hasty and undignified. Caleb stood there, a silent sentinel, until they were nothing but distant specks. He then turned and looked at Mai, who was watching him from the doorway, her eyes wide. In that moment, a silent vow passed between them, more binding than any word spoken before a preacher. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her. And in doing so, he had finally claimed his own life back from the ashes. Spring came to the valley not as a gentle suggestion, but as a riotous, determined rebellion against the long tyranny of winter. The snow receded, revealing the damp, dark earth, and soon, tentative shoots of green pushed their way toward the sun. The creek, freed from its icy prison, chattered and sang. The world was being reborn, and with it, the small family in the isolated cabin. The declaration Caleb had made to Barlow had changed everything. It was a line drawn not just in the snow, but through the center of their lives. The space between him and Mai, once a desolate expanse, was now filled with a quiet, burgeoning intimacy. He began to speak to her, not just in grunts and necessities, but in observations about the weather, the deer at the salt lick, the hawk that circled high above the valley. He told her the names of the wildflowers that bloomed on the hillside, and she, in turn, taught him the names of the stars in her own language, painting new constellations in his sky. He found himself watching her, the way the light caught the curve of her cheek, the quiet efficiency of her hands, the gentle way she spoke to his daughter, and now, to the growing child within her. The love he felt was a slow, rising tide, utterly different from the fiery, youthful passion he had shared with Sarah. This was a quieter, deeper thing, forged in silence and survival, tempered by shared sorrow and a hard-won respect. It was a love that felt as solid and enduring as the land itself. Lily, now chattering like the creek, was the bridge that spanned their two worlds. She would take his large, calloused hand and pull him toward Mai, insisting they look at a ladybug she had found, her small body a conduit of connection, weaving them together into a single tapestry. The baby arrived with the first summer rain, a gentle, cleansing shower that washed the last of the dust from the air. It was a boy, small and perfect, with a thatch of dark hair and Caleb's determined chin. Caleb was there, his fear a distant memory, replaced by a profound and steady calm. He held Mai's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, a silent anchor in her sea of effort. When the baby's first cry filled the cabin, it was not a sound of distress, but a declaration of life, a triumphant note that silenced the ghosts of the past for good. Mai, exhausted but radiant, looked at Caleb, and he saw his own awe and gratitude reflected in her dark, shining eyes. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gesture of such tenderness it felt like a prayer. He took the small, swaddled bundle and held his son for the first time. The infant was so light, a fragile miracle in his large, weathered hands. And Mai whispered from the bed, her voice soft. "It means peace." Caleb looked down at the child, then at Mai, and a slow smile, the first genuine smile in years, spread across his face. And he repeated, the name feeling right and true on his tongue. Peace. It was what she had brought him. It was what they had built together, out of the wreckage. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, a gentle melody of a life made whole. The cabin, once a hollow shell, was now overflowing. It was filled with the scent of milk and baking bread, the sound of Lily's laughter and soft coos, the quiet murmur of Caleb and Mai's voices in the evenings. The final scene of their healing was not one of high drama, but of simple, earned tranquility. On a warm evening, with the sun setting the western peaks ablaze in gold and rose, they sat on the porch. Caleb held Anne, who was sleeping soundly against his chest. Lily sat at Mai's feet, carefully arranging a bouquet of dandelions and clover in a tin mug. The small garden Mai had planted was now a riot of color and life, its bounty spilling onto the path. Caleb looked at his family, at this impossible, beautiful life he had been given. He reached out his free hand and covered Mai's, their fingers lacing together. It was not a beginning, nor was it an end. It was simply a continuation, a quiet testament to the fact that even in the harshest soil, after the most devastating fires, love, in its most patient and resilient form, could find a way to bloom.